All right, so why don't we go ahead and get started here? For those of you who don't know, we do what this is called a battle brief, meaning we handle campaigns in about an hour, a little bit less. Tonight's probably going to go almost to an hour because of the number of images we have. We try to get a lot of maps to show you where things happen, but then when possible, we try to show you what these locations look like today. And so we have a lot of that for this program in particular, of the images of where these things happen or what it looks like today. Maybe we'll encourage you to get out and see some of those places yourself. So we're not going to get into a lot of the nitty-gritty detail, but I think you'll enjoy seeing the locations, the retreat route after the siege of Petersburg. One thing I will say too is about 12, 13 years ago, the Army published a pamphlet series at the time of the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. And there were about 24, 25 pamphlets, all written by different authors. And that was everything from the Army before the Civil War through the campaigns to Reconstruction. And when I wrote the one on the Petersburg and Appomattox campaign, we made a conscious decision to combine these for the decision that the Appomattox, really the maneuver from Petersburg to Appomattox lasted a week. That would be a very short campaign indeed. And really the Appomattox campaign was the result of the fall of Petersburg. So that's really where we're starting from today. Let's go to the next slide if we could, Kenna. And we'll talk about what the situation was. The siege of Petersburg, Virginia, which is just below the, about 30 miles south of the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. And the siege of Petersburg was between Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and the main Union force in the east, the Army of the Potomac, led by General Meade, supplemented by a few other forces, the Army of the James in particular. But this was led, all these Union forces, including the independent cavalry under Sheridan, things along, other units along those lines, all commanded by Lieutenant General Ulysses Grant. And this siege went from the June 1864 until very early in April 1865. Now, we'll go to the next slide, and again, the overall command of the Confederate forces was under General Robert E. Lee, who commanded the Confederates that were defending in long lines, siege lines, and trenches, and positions, and forts, the Army of Northern Virginia. And we often hear it referred to as the siege of Petersburg, but really it would be more accurate to call it the siege of Petersburg and Richmond, because there were defensive lines that went from Petersburg up to Richmond, all north and south, and around Richmond as well. So we aren't going to get into the siege of Petersburg at all tonight, other than to say that and a few images. Let's go to the next slide. But the siege was between the armies of Lee and the Army of the Potomac and other forces. So on the right, you see General George Meade. He was the commander of the Army of the Potomac, the victor of Gettysburg. And he reported up to the head of all armies in the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant, on the left. And Grant made his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac, and eventually, this would be a good discussion sometime, of course, but he eventually took over the day-to-day operations of the Army of the Potomac in the East. So let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so here was the situation at the beginning, the end of March, early April 1865. And up at the top right, you can see that the city of Petersburg, and the red lines are the Confederate siege lines. And again, they go north of here, like off the map to the top of the map, up toward Richmond. But we're going to focus here this evening. The blue lines are the Union lines. And as you can see, the progression of the siege went from east to west. So initially, the fighting and the siege lines were over to the right of Petersburg, then just down from Petersburg, and eventually trying to get farther and farther west, meaning to our left, until Lee and the Confederates just did not have enough troops to man these defensive works. But the Union troops did. So by the end of March, the Union Army, commanded by Grant, the plan was that they were going to try to get around the Confederate right flank, which means the red line to the left of this map. And they were going to do that, the Union Army was going to do that by sending various elements around the Confederate right to try to get in their rear. So what you see here is the crossroads of Five Forks. This was April 1st, 1865, and the plan was to go around the right, hit Five Forks, where there was a Confederate detachment, and try to get in the rear. Now, what you can see also above the word Five Forks, the words Five Forks here, you can see the symbol for the railroad that goes above the kind of north of the Confederate positions. And that is the South Side Railroad. Originally, there was 5 railroads that went into Petersburg to supply Lee's army. But by this point, the only one that the Union Army had not cut was the South Side. And that's really what Grant and Meade's objective was here. And the plan was to send a mixed force of infantry and cavalry, both under the command of the officer you see at the bottom right, Phil Sheridan, a very aggressive infantry and cavalry commander that Grant knew that he could trust in order to be able to try to make this sweep around the Confederate left. So the Battle of Five Forks was fought on April 1st, and the Union Army was able to smash that position at the Forks, force a Confederate withdrawal, and an immediate advance to try to take advantage of getting on that railroad to finally end any chance that Lee's army could be supplied. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, this is the view of Five Forks today. The red dots there, that's where the Confederate position was at Five Forks. And it went off quite a ways to our right and our left, but this is the crossroads. The arrow that you see in the back, that was the road back north behind Confederate lines that would lead to the South Side Railroad. And that's what the objective of Sheridan and the cavalry and the infantry. What we see here is where the Union cavalry, which was dismounted by Sheridan, advanced on foot against this red line here, while the infantry came around to the right, and behind those trees you see on the right, kind of those dark trees, they came from behind that right and hit the Confederate left-hand position, smashed it. The Confederates retreated wildly back on that road toward the railroad and off to our left. But this was a very successful attack. Of April 1st, 1865. Lee got word of it fairly soon on the first, tried to kind of stabilize the lines. But this was really, could be argued, was really the breaking point where 10,000 Confederates fled, many of them captured. The Confederates were at this point were led by Pickett, General George Pickett of Gettysburg fame. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so on the next day, when Grant got word that Five Forks, which you can see over to on the bottom left corner of the map, when Grant got word on April 1st that Sheridan had broken in there and forced the Confederates to flee, their left flank was open. He ordered immediately that night an attack as soon as possible on April 2nd, all along this red line. And I have the blue arrow there, which shows where the 6th Corps broke through the Confederate lines on April 2nd, smashed through them, mainly because the Confederates just did not have enough troops to man those works. And the Union had finally smashed it. The Confederates were fleeing at this point. There's a lot of other details up near Fort Gregg and Petersburg that we just can't get into. But after the Blue Arrow troops there smashed the line, they turned to their left and started moving west from there behind the Confederate entrenchments, heading toward the railroad. As was Sheridan from Five Forks, and they were trying to hit the railroad, particularly near where you see that place called Sutherland Station on April 2nd. So we'll go over to the next slide and see a little bit more detail. All right, so Lee finally realized that this was the crisis, and he notified Jefferson Davis to evacuate Richmond. A lot of the Petersburg defending troops were now leaving the entrenchments. They wanted to head west. And Lee's goal at this point, which he did not develop suddenly, he always knew that at some point they would have to leave Petersburg, was to get supplies and head west, eventually along the railroad, so they could be supplied from the west, like Lynchburg and other places from the west, and eventually line up with the other large Confederate army in the east in central North Carolina, led by General Joseph Johnston. And that's where he was heading. That's what his plan was. So Grant basically knew this, and his generals assumed that that's what Lee's plan would be as well. And so when you think about this campaign and you see these diagrams that show the red lines going out toward Lynchburg to the west, and the blue lines following them or going below them, marching from east to west, just remember that the constant theme is that Lee was trying to get supplies for his men in the west, meaning between Lynchburg and Richmond, Lynchburg and Petersburg, but also at some point to be able to turn south and link up with Johnston. And Grant, using his subordinates, Generals Meade and Sheridan and Edward Ord and their Humphreys, was trying to catch up with Lee, but also to always try to stay below him to prevent him from going south, but also to march or ride as fast as possible to get in front of the Confederates so they couldn't go any farther and had to surrender. That's what's happening between April 2nd and April 9th. All right, next slide, please. Now, this is Sutherland Station. Now, for some reason, the map at the marker at the location of Sutherland Station out in Southside Virginia is oriented with where the north is pointed down, and it's a little bit different. So if you could just imagine flipping this 180 degrees, it's a little bit easier to manage. So this just demonstrates that one of the elements of the first engagements after Five Forks and the April 2nd breakthrough was when Confederates were trying to follow the South Side Railroad west to meet up at Amelia Courthouse, west of Petersburg. And they were caught up here by Union troops, attacked them and forced them to flee. This was a theme again for the next 7 days of the Union troops right behind the Confederates. Rarely did the Confederates have a day to rest or to try to ease up and find supplies other than at Amelia. But you can see that that's really what's going on here. This is another example, however, that I wanted to show folks is that you can, using guides by the state of Virginia and the Civil War Trails organization, you can follow the route of both armies, all the elements of the armies between Petersburg and Appomattox with a free map, but also signage that's out there on the site. So it's a great way to see the history of it, the location of it. And to give you an example, let's go to the next slide. That the Sutherland Station, the hotel, this is it today. That's still standing. The railroad is off to our right in this image, but this is where some of the Confederates made a stand, tried to defend themselves from the advancing federal forces. But at this point, all the evacuees of Richmond and Petersburg, the wagons, the troops, even the Confederate government were westward bound, trying to make it first to Amelia and then down into North Carolina. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, what you see here is kind of the trajectory of the two armies through about the 5th of April. So I don't want to rehash Five Forks again, but just to orient you, now Five Forks, which was on the 1st, that's down on the right, lower right. You can see Sutherland Station, that's where the Confederates were pushed off of that railroad, and when Sheridan's forces and the infantry, Union infantry, landed on Sutherland Station, they knew that they had permanently prevented the siege of Petersburg from going on, and now it was a race to try to find food for the Confederates and a race to prevent them from doing that by the federal forces. But that capture of that last railroad, that really marked the end of the Petersburg siege. So one other way that is kind of easier to look at this is up at the top of the map from right to left, you can see the Confederates moving to the west. And at the bottom of your map, you can see the dark blue line that goes from Sutherland Station down and dips down toward the bottom of the map and then turns back up again toward that green dot. That's where Burkeville is. That's where two railroads met together, and that was one of the objectives of Grant's forces. That march, that column that's heading toward the green dot, their main role was not to chase Lee, but to get out in front of him eventually, march faster, ride faster, prevent Lee from moving south to North Carolina and get out in front of him. Now, there's a middle column there you can see that's blue that goes from Sutherland Station to Namazine Church, and you see it says Meade and Sheridan. Meade, who commanded the Army of the Potomac, and Sheridan, who commanded the Union Army Cavalry, their job was to find and attack the Confederates under Lee, try to destroy them, get them to surrender, prevent them from getting any farther. And that's who is really doing the day-to-day attacks until the very end. So the orange dot you see there where it has April 4th, that's Amelia Courthouse. That was the immediate objective that the Confederates, who are spread out but all knew, get to Amelia because that's on the Richmond and Danville Railroad. And Lee had ordered rations, meaning provisions, food, for the troops to meet them there. And that's what he expected to find. The problem was when he got there on April 4th, when the Confederates started to arrive, the problem was that due to a miscommunication or a mistake, the supply trains were full of ammunition and military supplies, but not food. And Lee was very shocked and shaken by that. There's some first-person accounts by other officers and men who were with him showing that he was very taken aback. So he directed his foraging officers and sergeants to take wagons and horses out to the local community and see what kind of supplies that people would donate to try to get the men back fed and on the road again. Well, they didn't get much. There was not much to get. This area had been really raided for several months, and there wasn't enough really to get these troops fed. And perhaps even a greater problem was that Lee had wasted a day trying to get food, and his armies basically sat around that Amelia courthouse area. Okay, so just to get ahead of ourselves a little bit, because we have the map up. So we have Lee and Amelia courthouse, and we have Meade and Sheridan at the yellow dot along the Richmond and Danville Railroad, which was Lee's route. Meade and Sheridan managed to get troops and cavalry on the axis of the Confederate advance. It was a very successful maneuver, and that's at a place called Jetersville. Those of you who are from the Richmond area, this road that you see from Goods Bridge in the map to Amelia to Jetersville, that is modern US 360, and you can see a lot of these locations along there. So when Lee started to move out from Amelia Courthouse, he got word that the Union troops were at Jetersville. And you can see that the orange and the yellow dots are very close to each other. So when Lee advanced on Jetersville and found out that the road was blocked, you can see that red dotted line heading off to the left before Jetersville. So Lee had to avoid Sheridan and Meade right there at Jetersville. And instead of going toward the Burkesville and south, remember, Lee's trying to get to North Carolina. He's trying to get supplies. There was no way he could get to Burkeville at all to keep moving toward North Carolina. And if you see on the map, the red dot at the top is a little place called Painesville there. At the time of the Civil War, it's actually called Payne's Crossroads. Lee had some wagons coming down from that had evacuated Richmond, and you can see the dotted line comes from off the map to the top, makes a westward turn and goes to Painesville. Union force struck those wagon trains right there at Painesville, destroyed hundreds of wagons. There was a rolling fight in that area. I'll show you some more pictures of this later and some more maps. But that Payne's Crossroads was another kind of defeat for Confederate fortunes, because their food supplies in those wagons could not reach the main body. Okay, let's go one more slide here. This is the Burkeville train station. And again, we saw in the last map that this was where Lee was headed to try to eventually stay on the railroad, get supplies, but also head to North Carolina. But the Union troops under General Ord, that was the bottom line going east to west, they occupied this junction. This is a public site, can be easily seen and walked around right off the roadway. Next, please. Okay, the Payne's Crossroads and Paineville. On the left it's hard to make out. If you can go on the Library of Congress website and start looking at these images, which a lot of these contemporary images are from there, and find this one at Payne's Crossroads, it's a lot easier to see. but that's the crossroads on your right. That's the crossroads is where it's a little bit hard to tell, but there's a road coming in from the left that is the crossroads just past that large overhanging tree on the left. This is where, and a little bit beyond our vision here, farther away, this is where those wagons were destroyed. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so let's look at this map here. By the way, this map was provided courtesy of the cartographer Hal Jesperson, who does a lot of these for websites and books and that. It does great work. So this is some of his work that I wanted to recognize as we use it here. Okay, you can see Amelia Courthouse on the right-hand side. Again, that's where the Confederates were concentrating. And again, below them, it really illustrates Grant and Meade's pursuit, because you can see that blue line that starts on the right with Humphreys, then Griffin, then Sheridan's cavalry. You can see that they occupied the railroad town of Jetersville and prevented Lee from reaching Jetersville, which is why the red arrow, the red line goes north all of a sudden around Amelia Springs. And at the bottom, you can see where Ord's name is. His army goes to Burkeville and starts trying to head toward Farmville. At this point, Farmville on the Appomattox River, a railroad town. Lee knew there'd be supplies there, and since there were none at Amelia, and he couldn't use the railroad to get down to Burkeville, he was going to go overland to the Appomattox River and get supplies at Farmville. So this is what it looks like, as you can see, April 5th, April 6th, and April 7th. Okay. All right, next slide, please. All right, now this is an action at Deatonville. Not very well known. Some of you may who are even Civil War buffs don't know this one very well. But this is just after Payne's Crossroads, on the way to Farmville. There was a fairly sharp action here where the Union troops who were tailing part of Lee's army got into the rear guard, attacked aggressively, and forced the Confederates back. To orient you a little bit here, and I know it's a little bit hard to see, but the road that you see, the main road right there, to our right, the Confederates would wind up retreating from left to right down this road on their way to Farmville by way of Sailor's Creek. And the Union troops that were coming at them were coming kind of toward the left, top left, where you see that board fence, and all across the top of the image kind of attacking toward where this sign is located. Let's flip to the next one. I can show you a map that illustrates it better. The north is facing downward. So if you flip that around, the Confederates will really be retreating west. But west is to our right here, and the intersection here, Deatonville. That star is where that sign was that was in the last picture. So they were forced back down what's now modern 617 Sailor's Creek Road to Sailor's Creek, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, let's push on to the next slide. Now, again, the map, the green dot there you see is where Deatonville is. That's where we just talked about. And I wanted to show you this illustration because you can see at Paineville up on the top right, almost off our map, you can see the dotted red line moving to the left, meaning west, and then south to join up with the Confederate line, while other Confederates kept going. And right where that green arrow is, the two roads that the Confederates were on retreating to the left joined at Deatonville and became one road, which was a problem because, as you know, Civil War armies travel with a lot of wagons. So now the Confederates were reduced to having their infantry, cavalry, and the bulk of their wagons located on just one road. So not good for them. And we will also see some other locations here we're going to talk about in detail. Sailors Creek, then High Bridge, then Cumberland Church. And at the Star, you see where Rice's station was. That's where the kind of the southernmost part where the Confederates defended against the Union pursuit. Now let's talk about Grant and the Union Army. On the bottom right, where you can see Burkeville, we remember that. That's where the two railroads crossed, and where General Ord's Army of the James had gone to. So now Ord moves northwest from Burkeville, heading toward Rice's station, and blocking the Confederates from going south. So they were being pursued from the east, as you can see, and also from the south. And once they were blocked at Rice's station, and there was an action at High Bridge, which we'll talk about, you can see where there are two pursuits again, actually three lines there you see, where Sheridan and Griffin are along the south of Farmville area, and the other Union troops are to the north and east, again, preventing Lee from getting to North Carolina. And these Union troops are marching hours and hours a day. Sheridan has 3 divisions of cavalry, which is enormously helpful to try to get in advance of the Confederates. All right, next slide, please. So at Sailors Creek, which was west of Deatonville, this was really the biggest battle after Petersburg in Virginia. And at this point, this is kind of the rolling terrain here that you see. It was fairly open. At this point, the Union troops were able to get up with the rear part of the army, of the Confederate Army. And let's go back to the map that we just had, if you could, please, and I'll explain it a little bit more. So what Lee was doing here, you see where the red star-shaped battle sign for Sailors Creek is. What Lee was trying to do, again, was get to the town of Farmville, which is that red, gray square that you can see with the arrow pointing to Farmville. And he was moving, but as he moved toward Rice's station, he realized, and so did his aides and his other officers, that there was a sound of battle behind them, and that the troops following the main column were not coming on anymore. And that's because at Sailors Creek, the Union troops were close enough to get into it with the Confederate forces, who had to stop their retreat, occupy positions on the west side of Sailors Creek, and prevent the Union troops from attacking and capturing their wagons. So this is what the crisis was. Lee rode back to Sailors Creek and observed the battle. So let's go back again. Thanks for going back on the map, Kenna. There were several aspects of Sailors Creek. There were actually 3 different episodes and geographical positions here that all lumped together as the Battle of Sailors Creek on April 6th. And when I was out here on this battlefield taking pictures and following the action and walking trails, I realized that we could easily do one whole battle brief just on Sailors Creek. Might do that maybe next spring. But this house here is the Hillsman House, used as a hospital later. This house is original to the period. And the image that you see here with the caisson and the gun, this is the Union position. The house itself is this picture on the right was taken from the yard of the house, so it's behind us if you're looking at the right picture. And if you look pretty carefully, you'll see on the other side of this broad field that the cannon is overlooking, there's a row of trees, and you can make out on the other side of the trees, which is where the creek is, high ground that's a little bit open there. That's where the Confederate position was. So, and this was at the Hillsman House. The other phases of the battle were to the left of that cannon, way off at a crossroads where part of the Union Army was striking General Ewell's position, and then off to the right of this image, which was where Gordon's men, General John B. Gordon's men, were guarding the wagon train, and they had gone off to the west and separated from Lee's army. So it's a very detailed battle. We won't get into it tonight, but let's go to the next slide. I can show you a little bit more of this. Now, you remember that open ground I pointed to in the last slide, the last image that showed where the Confederate position was. This is the Confederate position looking back on the Confederate line. Excuse me, this is the Confederate line looking back on the Union line. And you can see in the distance, there's the White House. That's the White House that we saw in the last slide. And down below us, you can see that there's low ground, there's trees down there. That's Sailor's Creek. A lot of the action was there. It was very hand-to-hand fighting for quite a while. The Confederates had to surrender almost 8,000 men, including several generals. Lieutenant General Ewell, one of Lee's corps commanders, another corps commander, General Richard Anderson, Lee's son, Rooney Lee, who was a cavalry general. This was a disaster for the Confederates. And if Five Forks at the beginning was really signaled the end of the siege of Petersburg, from here on in, with those kind of losses, and Lee's only got by this point probably 40,000 men, maybe even 35,000 after the surrender. It was a disaster. All right, next slide, please. All right, this is a great image at the time showing the Confederates surrendering, Ewell's corps surrendering. If you're not familiar with military etiquette from the 18th and 19th century, the soldiers there that you see on the right holding their guns upside down, that's called clubbing your musket or clubbing your rifle. That's a signal that you're not going to shoot anybody and that you're asking for quarter to surrender. So great image there. Next slide, please. All right, so this is on the section of the battlefield where Gordon was trying to escape on the north edge of the battlefield, which, by the way, is a Virginia State Park, very lovely place. And all those rolling hills that you saw in those images, it's very undisturbed by any modern buildings and development, that kind of thing. So please try to get out there if you get a chance. You can really spend a lot of time there. There's trails. Thanks to the state of Virginia for the park, but also to a lot of preservation groups who were able to save even more land. So very well worth it. But this is around this house here overlooks the bridge that you see here. That was called the Double Bridges at the time. And I show you this because the house is on high ground, and General Gordon was trying to make a stand with the Confederates on the right of the picture where you see the bridge facing back toward us. But the Union advance was very aggressive. It was under General Humphreys. And the wagons, by the time, once the troops got to these bridges, it was just too many wagons and too much confusion to get over that. And Gordon was able to extricate most of his troops, but lost most of the wagons. And there's a lot of great signage here. It's all very, very easy to see. So let's again, Sailor's Creek, a huge Confederate defeat, and at this point they just need to get this to Farmville to try to get food. Go ahead. All right, so after Sailor's Creek, part of the Army on their way to Farmville needed to cross the Appomattox River near and across what was called, and still is today, High Bridge. And this was on the way to Farmville. That's a contemporary image on the left, and that is a modern image on the right. And there's again, another state park, High Bridge State Park, that includes the old railroad bed, and you can cross over this bridge on foot and by bicycle. And it's part of a 26-mile biking and walking trail. It's beautiful. So if you ever get a chance, it's just outside Farmville. But this is where the Confederates retreated, and the direction of their retreat in both pictures is from the direction that we are looking into the background. So that's the way they were headed. All right, on the way to Farmville, you can see right here, High Bridge is on our right, on the left of our map, and Farmville is on the left as well, just under where you see the red dot next to the word high. Okay, right under the word Ville. And you can see also this covers back to where we talked about Painesville and Deatonville. The Confederate forces needed to get a water barrier between them and the Union pursuit, which at this point had become very aggressive. So Rice's Depot is there too. That's where the blocking position I described earlier. All right, next. This is the modern Rice's Depot. So the part of Longstreet's Corps, which was a Confederate Corps under Lee, they part of Longstreet's Corps had defensive positions here. The actual depot is just beyond these two buildings, two brick buildings. You can see kind of a crossing there. That's now a biking trail along the railroad bed. But this is kind of where a Confederate position was established to prevent the aggressive Union troops from advancing toward Farmville to get in High Bridge to give the Confederates time to get across the bridge and over into Cumberland County and get supplies from Farmville. All right, let's press on here since I want to wrap up and give some time here. This is Farmville here on the south side of the Appomattox River. On the right, we're looking from the south side where the Union positions were, and looking just beyond those trees is the river, and on the other side of the river were the Confederate positions. Some of the Confederate Army was able to get provisions here and eat and rest a little while, but the Union pursuit was so aggressive that the rearward column of the Confederates was really so hard pressed that they could not partake of rest at all. So they wound up heading directly north from Farmville to try to access the road network, heading now toward Lynchburg. So from Farmville to Lynchburg, they're on the way west, and it was at Farmville that, and I'm going to read you just a short passage. It was at Farmville that Grant arrived with Meade's forces trying to chase Lee, and this is where he wrote the first message to Lee requesting or suggesting that they enter into some discussions about surrendering. So from here, Grant wrote, "I regard it as my duty to shift from myself the responsibility of any further effusion of blood by asking of you the surrender of that portion of the Confederate Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia." So this is where the first of several back and forths happen between Farmville and Appomattox. All right, let's move on one more. So the next action, you can see it's a little hard. This is a contemporary image on the left, a contemporary map, very nicely done, colorful, from the Library of Congress. Farmville is down there on the lower left-hand side, and you can see it's on the lower side of the Appomattox River. And all of the Confederates by this point go north of the Appomattox on the road, and I'll show you a better map so you can see where Cumberland Church is, but you can see up in the left-hand map on the left-hand corner, there's kind of an oval-shaped, moon-shaped curve position with red lines. Those lines are all around Cumberland Church. So the Union troops have come in on the northeast of that position, where you can see just barely some of those blue lines, and they want to try to block the Confederates from moving any farther north, but also come in from the south. And that's the church on the right. That's still standing. That's the original, or at least in the Civil War time. The congregation goes back into the mid-18th century. There's been some recent development, preservation work there. Some successes there in the last 12 to 18 months. So there's some good news about trying to save some of the battlefield there. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so the red dot on the lower right is Farmville. The cross there is Cumberland Church. That's where the Confederates retreated to. And up on the top right, I've put Humphrey's name, and to avoid confusion, I didn't put where all his troops were. But at this point, you had the south of the Appomattox River. Now remember, Lee and the Confederates are north of the Appomattox River, heading west. And by this time, Sheridan and the Union cavalry are headed west from south of the Appomattox River. So they go from Farmville eventually out to the dot on the left says Appomattox Courthouse and Appomattox Station. That's where they're trying to get to prevent Lee from getting to the railroad at Appomattox and moving on to where they thought there were some additional supplies at Lynchburg, which is off to our left, about modern time, about 40 to 45 minutes west of Appomattox. But the main pursuit happens north of the Appomattox River, and particularly by troops under General Humphreys. Now, Lee gets to that crossroad where you see the little house symbol. It looks like it's from Monopoly, and it says Clifton. And Clifton is just west of that intersection. That's where Lee's army turns to the left at Clifton and heads left west to where you see the red dot called New Store. And Humphreys is going to, and other Union troops are going to press them down these backcountry roads when they're heading toward Appomattox. And it's worth saying, there's a lot of markers out there on these places. You might think that on these Virginia country roads, some of which are still gravel, that there wouldn't be any markers or anything, but there are plenty of markers and interpretive signage there, so it's well worth it. So let's follow along here. Humphreys chasing Lee. Let's go to the next slide. I showed you where Clifton was. That's the house at Clifton. And on the night of the 7th, Lee and his staff had stayed there and made that their headquarters overnight. And the way this campaign worked, the Union troops were so close to the Confederates that after the Confederates left Clifton and went toward Appomattox, General Humphreys used this house as his headquarters the very next night. So they were very close there. And on the right is the area around New Store. This road was this is part of the route where the Confederates came from the distance toward us and then veered off toward our right. Humphreys following right behind. There's not really much at New Store. There's one sign that's there, but not much else as far as a village anymore. Okay, next slide. This is a great little place here. This is called Lackland Well. It's a antebellum house, plain simple farmhouse. But this was here at the time of the retreat. That's actually the drive going up to the farm, but it was taken, the image I took from the roadway, but both armies passed from left to right in front of this house, and there are several of these locations along the way. Okay, let's start to wrap it up here. Please go to the next slide. All right, our last map here. You can see the routes. The Cumberland you can see is cut off, but that's Cumberland on the right, Cumberland Church. You can see where the Confederates made their left turn and followed the red line. Meade and Humphreys chasing them past Clifton, New Store, and on to Appomattox Courthouse, which is on the right-hand side. You can see, I'm sorry, the left-hand side of the map. There's Appomattox Station, and just to the right of it, upper right of it, is Appomattox Courthouse. So we can see where Meade followed Lee to Appomattox, but let's look down on the southern pursuit, because from Farmville, that's where you can see that Sheridan and Ord were maneuvering to the west, not chasing Lee. Remember, you can see there's no Confederates where they are until they get to Appomattox Station. And they get there and they get on the railroad. They're now blocking the railroad at Appomattox Station. Lee realizes, okay, there is no way we're getting to Lynchburg. There's no way we're getting to North Carolina. There's one final battle right around the courthouse area at Appomattox Courthouse. And Lee finally decides it's time to surrender. The negotiations go on, and the Confederates eventually, and I'm going very quickly through this because we could easily have a whole program just on the last 2 days. But Lee surrenders at Appomattox. Let's go to the next slide. At Appomattox Courthouse. Now, the courthouse there, for those of you who have not been there, a lot of folks have been there, or I'm sure, that are watching tonight, but for the courthouse building is on the right. That's the reconstructed courthouse building that is part of Appomattox Courthouse National Historical Park. Great place to visit if you've never been there. Still a bucolic setting today. But the actual surrender happened at the McLean House on your left. And inside the McLean House, you can see there that is the refurnished parlor where Lee and an aide met with Grant. There's the famous story where they were trying to make small talk. Lee had come in his dress uniform, dress sword, polished boots, and brought one of his staff members with him. Grant had been riding along the south pursuit with Sheridan and Ord, had not had time to change when he found out about the Lee wanting to discuss terms of surrender. So he came in his campaign uniform, mud-splattered boots, a private's coat. Lee made no mention of that. And to make small talk, Grant tried to engage in some conversation, said, well, I remember that I had met you during the Mexican War, during the Winfield Scott's Mexico City campaign. And, excuse me, Lee said something along the lines of, yes, I don't remember that we had met before, which could be taken as a slight, and some of Grant's staff members did take that as a slight, meaning you weren't worthy of being noticed. But Grant really didn't take it that way, and Lee never said anything about that. But they surrendered. About 28,000 Confederate soldiers surrendered there, and this marked the end of the Army of Northern Virginia. The Union Army under Grant, Meade, Sheridan, Ord, others successful, and eventually the other surrenders happened as well. So we're going to stop there just before 8 o'clock. I'm going to try to get to some of these here. Let's see. The first one, as Grant took more control during this campaign, did this cause tension between Grant and Meade, who commanded the Army of the Potomac? Great question. Everybody wonders about that, Chris. Really, Grant had taken over in May of 18. Well, actually, Grant was appointed general of commanding general, lieutenant general in March of 1864. Decided to remain with the Union Army of the Potomac, and as time went on, Meade became less independent, and Grant issued orders and what have you. The two never really argued with each other. Grant tried to go through the right channels. Meade had a prickly personality. The real problem was that Grant gave Sheridan eventually independent command of the cavalry, and Meade did not like Sheridan at all. They argued a lot. They often went to Grant as a referee, but that they were not friends in any sense of the word. So thank you for the question. Let's see. Okay, in the book Robert E. Lee and Me, Professor Ty Sedgley, let me get back to that, sorry, believes one should stop using Union Army when United States Army is more appropriate. Here in Richmond, I find using U.S. Army helps in discussion with various parties. What is your opinion? Okay, Tom, this is my opinion. This is not an official Army history position. At the time of the Civil War, reference to the U.S. Army meant the U.S. regular army. That meant the pre-war army that Lee and Meade and Grant and Ord and Sheridan and you name it was in after most of them had gone to West Point. So U.S. Army is totally appropriate for the Civil War, but it really didn't encompass in the minds of the people of the time of the huge volunteer force that was needed and recruited and volunteered and trained and fought and died. That was more appropriately called the Union Army. So again, my opinion and that of others too, but I totally get your question there. How many casualties are suffered by each side during this period? It's very difficult to tell. It's easier on the northern side. It's estimated that the troops that pursued the Confederates from Petersburg numbered about 80,000. Lee probably left the Petersburg-Richmond area with about 55 to 60,000. One of the interesting aspects of this campaign is that the Confederates, as you know, from hopefully listening to the narrative, as they went west, they were not met by supplies. They didn't get these supplies they needed, and many of them had not eaten from the time they left Petersburg to the time they get to Farmville, days. So more and more of the troops with exhaustion just either left the columns, deserted, quit, gave up, or just passed out on the side of the road and got captured by the pursuers. Is this really the week where Custer gains his fame? I think his Civil War fame came a little bit earlier than this. This is really a Sheridan cavalry show, although Custer was one of his subordinates. I'm not totally sure if you have a specific action that you can note. What was Chamberlain's role during the surrender? Really didn't cover that much, but after the surrender, the next day, there was arrangements were made for the Confederates to march into the courthouse area, lay down their arms, move to their camps. They were fed by rations by the Union troops. But at that surrender ceremony, Chamberlain was given command of the Union contingent that was managing that. I know it's thought of that he had his men salute, and again, that's another kind of controversy that we just don't have time. Maybe we should do another program on just the last 2 days or all the surrenders across the country. Okay, well, folks, we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you, everybody.